Okay, let's dive in. We're really getting into some pretty thought-provoking stuff today. Looking at masculinity, relationships,
Mhm.
how society's shifting. And our mission, like always, is to pull out the key ideas, the really surprising bits from this specific source we're looking at. And it's important to say right up front, we're here to explain the concepts in the material. Not saying we agree, but just laying it out clearly, giving you that informed view.
Right, and what's fascinating here, or what the material claims is fascinating, is that it tries to dig deeper than just, surface stuff.
Hmm.
It talks about foundational truths,
Hmm.
about human behavior, how we're conditioned, as it puts it. So our job here is really to synthesize all that, break it down, give you the clarity, the context, so you can get your head around these concepts quickly without feeling totally swamped. And the material itself really poses this question, doesn't it? How do these dynamics, these deep-seated things the author talks about, how do they actually play out in our day-to-day lives?
Indeed. Yeah, that's the core question. So let's start with the context. This term you sometimes hear, the manosphere.
Mhm.
Basically, it's an online community, well, collection of communities, really, where people discuss masculinity, the nature of women, that sort of thing. And a really key text in this space, and it's our main source today, is The Rational Male. Now, this book, it has a kind of interesting history. It started out explaining what it calls red pill intersexual dynamics, think the Matrix taking the red pill.
Yeah.
It's that idea. A perspective claiming to show these uncomfortable truths about relationships, about society, stuff that challenges the usual narrative. But then it sort of evolved, focusing more on what the author calls positive masculinity,
Hmm.
trying to help men improve their lives overall, not just in dating.
That's a really good way to frame it. And the author, well, his view of this red pill idea, it's not like a strict doctrine. He calls it a praxeology.
Praxeology? Okay.
Yeah, it's a term he uses to mean like a loose science, meaning in this context, it's always open to new information, right? New experiences men have. So it can be reinterpreted, tweaked, experimented with. It's presented as a living study, constantly changing. And the purpose, according to the author, is to help unplug guys who are struggling, help them understand the what's and the whys behind their situation, get them to a point where they're ready to dissolve the barriers to this red pill awareness. The book's meant to be something then go back to, highlight things, discuss it. He's very clear it's not meant to be some kind of Bible to thump, or a flag for some new masculinity movement.
Right, not a manifesto, more like a framework.
Mhm.
And that idea of the red pill lens seems pretty central to his argument. He basically frames it as this filter you can use to understand, well, everything. Pop culture, social norms, even just casual chats.
Yeah.
And the material suggests that this unplugging, becoming red pill aware, often it apparently comes from some kind of personal trauma or some woman's rejection.
Yeah, difficult experience.
Exactly. It's described as a bitter pill to swallow, definitely. But maybe also a moment when someone's more receptive to new ideas. The author does acknowledge this can lead to feeling, well, disillusioned, even nihilistic sometimes. When guys start thinking their past decisions were based on what the source calls a blue pill paradigm.
False pretenses, essentially.
Yeah, the idea that they were operating under false assumptions about how things really work.
Okay, so moving on to another really core concept in this material, the author introduces this idea he calls the feminine imperative. He describes it as a kind of feminine primary social order. And in his view, this order tends to frame traditional masculinity as, toxic or hypermasculinity, basically making masculinity itself sound like a bad word for men. And from this perspective, the claim is that women might define masculinity in ways that benefit them. Often the text argues it's kept deliberately vague, this sort of feminized ambiguity, leading men to think masculinity is something they should avoid or suppress.
Hmm.
If we try to connect this to the bigger picture, the material is really suggesting there's this societal effort, almost like social engineering,
Why?
not just to feminize boys and men, but to redefine what genuine masculinity even is, defining it through a kind of feminine correct ideology. It's definitely a strong claim presented in the source.
That is a really striking claim, especially when he talks about fathers. He paints this picture, this paradox, where dads are seen with contempt and suspiciousness if they're actively involved. But then they get blamed for every social ill if they're absent. It's a catch-22, sort of. The feminine imperative, as the author puts it, is apparently all too happy to assume authorship of a child's successes. And it only values a dad's input if it, fits the plan, if it coincides and agrees with the feminine primary plan. And the supposed impact on kids, according to this book, it's painted as pretty profound. Things like fempowerment and feminine correctness, they lead to girls being described as male entitled. and how they see themselves. And boys, they're taught to loathe their maleness, maybe even want to remake their gender identity more like girls. The author really doubles down, warning that the village will raise your kids if fathers step back. And he even suggests, quite provocatively, that being red pill aware could eventually be treated like child abuse. It really doesn't hold back in its critique, does it?
No, not at all. And the argument goes further. It says this feminine imperative actively tries to control men's intersexual communications.
Meaning how men talk to other men.
Exactly. To stop them forming a unified collective understanding of masculinity, the claim is that this imperative hates and is terrified of men defining and asserting masculinity for themselves. So this deliberate obfuscation and ambiguity about what authentic masculinity is, the author sees it as a tactic, a way to keep women on a kind of pedestal, implying that only women hold the key, the solution to men's problem of maleness. He gives an example. This idea of gender abridgment in language, like a specific law in Washington state gets mentioned.
Oh, interesting.
As an example of trying to re-engineer society, right down to the basics of how we communicate. So within this framework, the author begs the question, right? How is a man supposed to navigate a world where, according to this view, his manhood itself is seen as a threat? And just calling yourself a man might get you feminine ridicule.
Okay, so that's the societal backdrop painted by the author. How does the material then zoom in on individual relationships, male-female dynamics, within that context?
Yeah.
That seems to bring us to what it calls intersexual dynamics. And a huge concept here is hypergamy. The book introduces it as almost like evolved psychological firmware in women.
Right, a core programming, so to speak.
And the author explains it as basically women's innate ability, or maybe capacity, to feel less troubled about emotionally divesting from one man and moving to another more fluidly than men typically do.
That's the core idea presented.
The material also takes aim at the myth of the biological clock. And it talks about this epiphany phase for women, usually around, 28 to 31?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Where the author claims women start to rethink their past choices and look more towards long-term provisioning security, which, according to the text, leads to this dynamic of, what's the phrase, alpha fucks and beta bucks.
Yeah, that's the term used.
Suggesting women optimize this kind of dual strategy.
That's the interpretation given, yes.
And then there's alpha widows, women who are apparently so affected by a past alpha lover that a future beta provider in this framework just can't measure up.
Right. Can't compete emotionally or sexually.
So the main takeaway here, from the material's perspective, is this claim that women's evolutionary strategy, this hypergamy, drives them to constantly seek higher status partners. And that impacts relationships in ways that often clash with our usual romantic ideals.
And building on that, the material lays out a cardinal rule of relationships, which is the person with the most power is the one who needs the other the least. Simple as that, almost.
Okay, that sounds quite transactional.
It's presented that way.
Yeah.
And applied to marriage, the author suggests the wife often holds more power if the husband makes her the gatekeeper of his own sexuality, as he puts it. There's another rule, too, the cardinal rule of sexual strategies, basically. For one gender's sexual strategy to succeed, the other gender must compromise or abandon their own. A zero-sum game, in a sense.
Wow, okay.
And then there's communication. Big differences highlighted there. Women's style is described as covert, reserved, subject to context, nuance, with this inward self-focus, often using personalized anecdotes that, in this view, can trump objective facts.
And
men's communication is painted as overt, blunt, content-driven, more about the information itself. So the author is pretty critical of that whole good communication solves everything idea.
The therapy trope.
Kind of, yeah. He states that appealing to women's logic and relying on deductive reasoning is the calling card of a beta mind. Because, the argument goes, arousal, attraction, sexual tension happen indirectly for women, below the surface, not through logical debate. And then there's a really strong assertion that women fundamentally lack the capacity to empathize with the male experience and male pain.
That's a very strong claim indeed.
It is. He cites examples of, male injuries or struggles being dismissed.
So that naturally leads to challenges within marriage, as seen through this lens. The material mentions an article, American Parenting is Killing American Marriage, picking up on that idea that women tend to prioritize kids over the husband.
That's discussed, yes.
And it also suggests that when married men face issues with intimacy, it's often not about lack of opportunity, but a lack of desire from the woman. viewing things like date night as just, well, a Band-Aid, not fixing the core issue described.
A superficial fix, yeah.
And interestingly, it talks about attention as a kind of tool. The idea being if you give attention too freely, it loses value. It
Yeah.
devalues you. So the provocative suggestion is that by subtly withdrawing attention, a man might prompt his partner to seek it again, potentially reigniting that desire.
It's presented as a dynamic of value exchange.
And then there's the whole good guy myth the author tackles, the belief that if a man could just balance those alpha and beta traits perfectly, he'd be the perfect catch.
Right, the ideal blend.
But the material claims women actually compartmentalize. They want alpha for sex, beta for security and resources.
That's the assertion.
It says they want Mr. Perfect because that is who he already is without having to be told, meaning they aren't looking to build him.
Right. The attraction is to the finished product, so to speak.
So, what does all this boil down to for men seeking real connection, according to this source? It really seems to suggest that our conventional ideas about relationships, they might not mesh with these deeper evolutionary dynamics the author describes.
Yeah, it presents a stark contrast. And moving into the more practical side, red pill in practice, the material talks about red pill parenting. A key point is that a father's motivation has to be intrinsically rewarding, because in this view, society isn't likely to give him much external validation for it.
Okay, so do it for yourself and your kids, not for applause.
Pretty much. Fathers need to double down on their commitment, provide, educate, protect. And for dads raising boys, the advice is introduce this red pill awareness early on.
How early?
Ideally before the teen years. Because the conditioning from media, school, etc., the author claims it starts really young, maybe around age 5.
Wow, okay.
And it suggests praising sons when they use their red pill lens to analyze things.
And what about raising daughters from this perspective?
Teach them that men and women are different but complementary. That's the core message. And that masculine dominance, presented positively here, is beneficial, protective, and valid for both the daughter and her mother.
Okay, quite specific guidance there. And building on that practice theme, what about men who discover this stuff, this red pill awareness, while they're already married? The concept of reconstruction.
Right, that's a big topic in the book.
It introduces this pretty provocative idea of break up with your wife mentality.
Yeah, emphasis on mentality.
Right. Not literally leaving necessarily, but approaching your own self-improvement as if the new red pill you might not choose your current partner if you met her today.
Exactly. The self-work has to be a self-first proposition, focused on your own changes.
With no guarantee that your spouse will reevaluate you or adapt.
No guarantee at all, according to the text.
And related to that is the power of nekesti.
Which is basically the principle of eliminating the source of a problem.
Sounds simple, but
the material acknowledges it's incredibly hard for what it calls a matrix beta guy who's stuck in way now.
Venus, like being obsessed with one specific person.
Yeah, that fixation on the one, making it impossible to see alternatives or walk away. And digging deeper into that, there's the idea of a man's plan. The text states alphas plan, alphas act. And their confidence allegedly comes from having options.
Right.
So a man's personal plan, his purpose, it needs to be bigger than his desire for sex. It should supersede it. But it should also include using sex strategically to help achieve that plan.
Interesting distinction.
And it contrasts what the author calls men's idealism in love, which he ties to this burden of performance, always having to prove yourself, with what he describes as women's pragmatic, hypergamously rooted opportunism.
Opportunism.
Yeah. And a really critical point made is that strength is amoral. Meaning, from this evolutionary perspective, women are attracted to and reward strength itself, not necessarily goodness or justice in a moral sense.
That's quite a statement.
It is. And the material often circles back to this idea that evolutionary psychology just analyzes the how and why these dynamics work, without the varnish of morality, as the author puts it. Even if the conclusions seem raw or they, offend ego-invested sensibilities.
Just describing the is, not the ought, from its perspective.
That's the claim.
And stepping back one last time, the broader societal picture painted by the author, he reflects on how things like free love ideas, egalitarian equalism, how they've spread worldwide. And sometimes, the argument goes, they lead to similar outcomes for women's socioeconomic status across very different cultures. Yet the blame, often, still gets shifted onto men.
That's the observation made in the text.
So the author's final call to action for men reading this material is basically set the example. Refuse to compromise on your principles. Keep doing what fathers have always done. Provide, educate, and protect, especially in what he sees as a collapsing world.
And there's a strong emphasis on mentoring younger men, too, calling it supremely valuable and needed.
Okay, so wrapping this up, our deep dive today, it's really explored these core concepts from the source material. The red pill idea, the feminine imperative, these views on intersexual dynamics based on evolutionary psychology. As always, the aim is just to give you a clear, informed understanding of what's in this specific and, yeah, often controversial material.
Absolutely. And this exploration of the source, it really does suggest from the author's viewpoint that our usual understanding of gender roles, of relationships, it might be shaped by these unseen forces, maybe even biological ones, as he argues. Which leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? If we acknowledge these deeper currents, these dynamics presented in the material, how might that change our own personal choices? How we approach those big societal conversations about men and women? Beyond, what we've always been taught.
That is definitely a powerful thought to sit with, especially given the arguments we've unpacked from the source. And here's where it gets really interesting for you now. How will this new lens, this information, reshape how you see the world around you?